Everyone, my name is Marissa Strauss. I am the Week 5 presenter for Social Influence Part 2 that covers Chapter 7, which is Conformity, and Group Processes, Chapter 8 from the Casson text. I've also included an outline that goes a little bit into further detail, which summarizes main concepts and key terms. Feel free to use that. I use it as kind of a quick reference guide. But if not, this is the presentation. So the topics that I'm going to be talking about today are automatic social influence, conformity, compliance, obedience. And then in Chapter 8, I've got group fundamentals, individuals and group performance, cooperation, and competition. So conformity is a big topic in social psychology simply because we do it automatically and don't really realize why we do it. And people just tend to copy each other. It puts them at ease. The chameleon effect is mimicking other people. Infants do it. Study partners have been seen to do it. Even cockroaches kind of are influenced by other people or other cockroaches. So what is conformity? Conformity is the tendency to change our perception, opinions, or behavior in ways that are consistent with group norms. And there was a couple of different key research projects with Massafur's Sheriff, where he had light in a dark room and asked people their response. And that changed between a person who was alone and a person who was in a group. So they tended to change their answer for where the light was, and if it was moving. And then Solomon Asch did an experiment with comparison lines, and participants were exposed to basically a line confederate who said, no, the length of the line is something that was clearly wrong, but participants conformed to majority 1/3 of the time. So why do people conform? There's basically two reasons. They need to be right, and they're afraid of ostracism. So groups typically tend to be right, majority is typically right, and that was shown by Sheriff's autokinetic task, and people just really weren't really sure where the light, where it was moving. And so the influence of other people just kind of reassured them that, okay, this is the right answer. And then fear of ostracism, simply put, people don't like to be excluded. And there's different types of conformity. There's private conformity and public conformity. Private conformity tends to be a little bit longer lasting, and that's the change of beliefs that occur when a person privately accepts the position taken by others. And public conformity is a superficial change in overt behavior without a corresponding change of opinion that is produced by real or imagined group pressures. So then you've got majority influence and minority influence. Majority influence focuses on group size, focus on norms, ally and dissent, and gender. So with group size, bigger isn't necessarily better. Research has shown that 3 to 4 people who agree with you will have the most impact. Focus on norms. Social norms cause conformity only when we know the norms and we focus on them. People often underestimate the significance that norms can have. Ally and dissent basically is the concept that people get by with little help. And in Asch's experiment, the presence of a single confederate who agreed with the participant reduced conformity almost 80%. And gender differences, originally they thought that gender differences would produce conformity, but it turned out that one's familiarity with an issue, not necessarily gender, affected conformity. Then moving into minority influence, it's never easy to stand out from a crowd and dissent, but it's also not impossible, and that's kind of shown and exemplified by our heroes or people that we admire. There's Moscovici's theory, which states that majorities are powerful by virtue of their sheer numbers, whereas nonconformists derive power from the style of their behavior. So it's not necessarily what they're saying, it's how they're saying. And his theory says that consistency is key, and that a dissenter needs to be forceful, persistent, unwavering in support, but also appear flexible and open-minded. Hollander kind of disagreed with him. He said you need to first become part of a group before you can deviate. and then that gave rise to idiosyncrasy credits. Still going back to outcomes of majority and minority influence, majorities tend to have greater influence on factual questions, and minorities have greater influence on opinion type questions. And the Reese article, I'll talk about later, actually. Moving into compliance, there's a couple of different ways that people get other people to comply. Compliance is defined as changes in behavior that are elicited by direct requests. And Anthony Prekins found 107 methods of social influence, and we'll just talk about a few of them. Mindlessness and compliance is one of them, and that's basically people are prone to wanting an answer. And Ellen Lager found that because sometimes it's powerful enough to get people to comply, she did a experiment where people cut other people in line at a copy machine, and they basically just said, I need to go first because I need to make copies. And that was enough. People were okay with it. The norm of reciprocity is the idea that the way that we treat, or we will treat others the way that they have treated us. And then there's a couple of different compliance techniques that the book talked about. There's foot in the door, lowballing, door in the face, and that's not all, folks. Basically, they're all a two-step compliance technique in which the influencer will manipulate the target person's self-image, the commitment to the product, feeling of obligation to the seller, or perceptions of the real request. So then we've got assertiveness. When do people actually put their foot down? And how can they put their foot down? The text talks about just by simply knowing these techniques, it helps people to stay vigilant and say no. And in general, people don't like feeling hustled or feeling manipulated. So sometimes those compliance techniques can backfire. In the Reese article about conformity in adolescence, it's a prime example where social groups encourage, majority groups can encourage individuals to drink, but it also talks about how individuals do abstain from unhealthy drinking behaviors. So that's an interesting article that kind of demonstrates assertiveness. Moving on to obedience. Obedience are inclined to obey. Authority has a big role in influencing people's behavior. And Milgram's research was one of the most controversial and surprising studies in regards to obedience. I won't go over the details, but his results showed that 65% of participants went to the highest shocks available, which was 450 volts. So that became very surprising, and people started asking, are we all Nazis, as the text put it? And the answer is no. Character plays a huge role, and that matters, and some people are simply more obedient than others. Some people with authoritarian personalities, that can be measured, the text talks about, on the F scale. And some personalities just are more aggressive towards subordinates. There were several various types of experiments that Milgram's study spurred, and it showed that there can be changes to obedience, and those three things are affected by authority, the victim, and the procedure. So just varying small things would actually reduce the obedience, which was encouraging and helped people realize that we might not always, there are conditions that will reduce just blind obedience. And then Milgram's experiment was also conducted more recently in the 21st century. And it's basically the repeat of the same experiment. And it showed that obedience to authority has declined a little bit over the years, but most of the results were the same. So that left a few lingering questions about why people follow orders and moral implications. And the text talked about situational momentum as well as engaged followership. Basically, people just get caught up in the experiment and the situation, and they want to help, or they just feel like they don't have any other choice. Then it talks about defiance, and when people rebel. And just like social processes can breed blind obedience, it can also spur dissent just because the presence of others encourages other people to continue down one road. So now we get to group processes. What is a group and why should you join one? A group is a set of individuals who interact over time and have shared fate, goals, or identity. There's a few different reasons why people join, but overall people join because they don't want to feel rejected, and being a part of a group helps to give people a sense of identity. There are a couple of key features that are associated with groups, and you've got roles, norms, and cohesiveness, as well as culture. Culture will play into that. Roles are a set of expected behavior. They can be formal or informal. The text talks about instrumental roles, which help groups to achieve tasks. And then you've got expressive roles, which provide emotional support or morale. Then you've got norms. Norms are the rule of conduct within a group. So sometimes groups have like this underlying understanding that, okay, we do this in this group and we don't do this in that group. And that was kind of explored a little bit further in the Holly article with collegiate athletes, and how they perceived outgroups, and if they actually made they perceived them as black sheep. So that article was part of our reading, and it's really interesting the results that they found on that. Cultures and norms. Different groups will foster different cultures. So sometimes you'll have a tight group with strong norms and little tolerance, and then you'll have loose groups with weak norms and greater tolerances. Cohesiveness is basically the extent to which people feel connected, feelings of intimacy, unity, and commitment to group goals. And group cohesiveness and performance go hand in hand. The closer a group feels, the better their performance will be, but it also works in the reverse. So if a group is performing well, that will help them to come together and become more cohesive. So then how do individuals actually react in a group? And there's two key topics in this. It's social facilitation and social loafing. Social facilitation is when others arouse us and basically inspire us to do better. So social facilitation is defined as a process whereby the presence of others enhances performance on easy tasks, but impairs performance on difficult tasks. And that was researched by Norman Triplett, and Zajonc came up with a better solution than what Triplett may have had. And his solution centers on the idea that the presence of others will increase arousal, which can affect performance, but it affects it depending on the actual task. And increased arousal, people will perform in the dominant response. The dominant response is basically the reaction elicited most quickly. So it's your knee-jerk or go-to reaction. And so that's why a lot of people in high-stress jobs will tend to overtrain, just simply to train in that dominant response, so that when they're in stressful situations, they go to their knee-jerk reaction. Then you have social loafing, and that's when others relax us. Social loafing is a group-produced reduction in individual output on tasks where contributions are pooled. And Alan Ingen found that people work about 20% harder when thought to work alone in a group. So how do you reduce social loafing? The text talks about 3 different ways, and that's to limit the scope of the project, keep groups small, and maintain peer evaluations. Moving on to de-individuation. De-individuation is the loss of a person's sense of individuality and the reduction of normal constraints against deviant behavior. So simply put, it's just people lose their sense of self, and they feel like they're anonymous and their individual responsibility is lower, and so they're kind of permitted to act extreme or do riots. Halloween's kind of a prime example where kids will do this, where they feel like nobody's watching them because they're in costume, and so they can take more candy. Group performances, there's several different types of group performances and interactions. You've got loss and gains in a group. Sometimes you have process loss and process gain, and that is just process gain. Loss is the reduction of group performance due to obstacles in the group, and process gain is the increase in group performance so that the group actually outperforms the individuals who make up the group. Then you've got brainstorming. Brainstorming we're all fairly familiar with, but researchers have actually found that brainstorming in a group is less effective than brainstorming alone. So people now try to brainstorm alone and then come together in a group to discuss their brainstorms. Group polarization is the exaggeration of initial tendencies and thinking of group members through group discussion. Groupthink can be a dangerous group decision-making style characterized by an excessive tendency among members to seek concurrence. And this can be dangerous just because you have a lot of smart people making bad decisions. And the text talked about a couple of ways to avoid that. And that is simply to avoid isolation by consulting others, reduce pressure to conform, and establish a strong norm of critical review. For goals and plans in group, the idea that do your best, that's not necessarily the most effective. Groups actually perform better with set, incentivized, specific goals. Groups can do well using technology. The text talks about group support systems, which is specialized interactive computer programs that are used to guide group meetings, collaborative work, and decision-making processes. Virtual teams are groups of people who work interdependently with shared purpose across space, time, and organization boundaries using technology to communicate and collaborate. And then culture and diversity, it's very important. Different cultures value different things. And then that brings us to collective intelligence. Are groups smarter together? And there are 3 things that actually will increase the intelligence of a group. And those are average sensitivity of group members, the tendency to allow groups to take turns participating, and then surprisingly, the higher proportion of women would influence group intelligence, and that's just simply because they tend to be higher in social sensitivity. Moving on to mixed motives and social dilemmas. Social dilemmas is a situation in which a self-interested choice by everyone will actually create a worse outcome for everyone. And that some of how that is manifested is in prisoner's dilemma and researcher's dilemmas. But people can try to negotiate. Negotiating is trying to get it better than a 50-50 split. And the text talked about integrative agreement, which is a negotiated resolution to a conflict in which all parties obtain outcomes that are superior to what they would have obtained from an equal division of contested resources. And then culture plays into negotiations as well. Different cultures are persuaded to negotiate on different values. So then that brings me to the questions this week. The first one is, how does being part of a group tie into previous topics we've learned about, such as social identity theory, self-worth, or various attitudes? And then the second one is, why do you think obedience in the Modern Day Milgram's experiment had similar results to the original Milgram experiment? And do you think Christianity lends itself to blind obedience? These are the references that I used, just the reading from this week. And I apologize, this went a little long, but I hope you guys have a great week.